With epicseven's new Origin update, there's a new activity that's been added to the game in the form of Ogre's Armory, and so today I'm going to break down everything about it, including whether it's worth it to do it or not, as this is something that technically has been argued and discussed in the past, where we were formerly introduced to this in the form of Goblomu's Goblin stage, etc. But without further ado, let's get into it. Now, first and foremost, if you're curious about how to unlock this content, you do need to unlock, or rather, I should say, you do need to complete the new 6th episode. Now, the thing is that the 6th episode, despite it sounding like it would come after the most recent or be one of the most recent activities, is not actually how it is. And in fact, it's a precursor to, I believe, the beginning of the game. Don't quote me on that, though, but it is at the earlier stages of epicseven now. Now, because of that, once you've completed the early or beginning episode, you will have access to this, which does make it a bit more beginner-friendly leaning. However, there may also be some other questions that you have about the system itself. Now, as you can see on screen right now, there are a few things worth mentioning. First, there are 4 different sets that you have access to. This is speed, crit, destruction, and health. These are very usable sets depending on where you are in the game, but in general, if you're able to make use of these pieces, or if you have high rolls for any of these sets, these are very meta sets, definitely not something that you'd throw away or trash. Now, in addition to this, you'll also see that there's a daily entries below that. It says 0 out of 10. This, of course, means that you only have 10 entries every day, and this was something that was shared with the Goblomu entries that we had in the past. Now, moving on from this, you will also be interested to know that despite there being a difference of this in the past, where you were only able to get 10, you can technically refund and purchase more of this. For the sake of this, by the way, I decided to pull a bunch of pieces of gear just so you kind of have an idea, which is why you see the daily purchase count at a 0. But in case you were curious, you can actually pay Skystones for additional runs. I promise this is just for content, though I definitely don't recommend doing this in general. Now, moving on, you may also be curious when this resets, and if you didn't see it already from the little pop-up here, it resets every day at reset, not the Guild War reset, but rather the epicseven daily reset, which is at 6 a.m. EST, and as far as I can tell, this is a permanent addition to the game. Now, to speak on this briefly, in case you're curious, or to speak on this briefly, you may also be wondering what the main appeal of this activity or the main appeal of this gear is. And to be blunt, the only appeal that this gear should have is really that it's easy to farm and that you can, in most cases, use this on, well, expedition characters or for some of your beginner characters. As you're seeing on screen right now, the equipment score that it starts out with is not amazing, and a lot of these sets, especially, or a lot of these pieces specifically you're seeing on screen, are not tuned or perfect, as they start with very low rolls, have very low roll potential, and you also can't really control what main stats they are. This isn't a situation where you can conversion box them or you can use the blue boxes to change the main stat, so not really worth it. Or I shouldn't say not really worth it, but you will struggle at times if you don't have the perfect piece already rolled for you. That said, it is filler gear, so that's fine. However, something that is worth also mentioning is that for certain characters, if we skip along to some of the Soul Weavers or defensive knights in the game, whether that's a character like Montmorency, or even in this case, a character like Angelica, here you go. This is actually a character that you can still see decent stat lines on, and just for the sake of this example, I did actually end up swapping to kind of give you an example of how similar or how close the different stat lines can look, despite this being, you know, a piece of gear that effectively only has 66 equipment score. Now, again, this is something that a lot of people fixate on, and although a lot of sentiment towards this gear is low equipment score equals not worth it, which, I mean, should be mathematically sound, as you can see here, there's actually not that big a difference between the builds that you can have with a piece of there's not that big a difference between the different setups that you can have with Goblomu or non-Goblomu or Ogre's Armory gear. And as you're seeing on screen right now, you have, again, the piece that I just showed with, in case you're curious, the boot, because I'm about to swap this in a moment. But even compared to another build that has quote-unquote 88 gear and also has a 90 reforged piece similar to the last piece of gear, this is still a very competitive or comparable piece, with the only difference here being roughly a couple hundred or a couple thousand HP or defense, though of course there is, well, I should say a little bit of HP and a little bit of defense, but hundreds of defense is quite significant, and of course there is a difference in speed. Now, of course, something that you could consider here is the difference in rolls, as this Goblomu piece is effectively perfectly rolled for defensives. But again, as this is 66 equipment score, and as you of course do have the speed and the value of the 88 piece, it is just something worth considering or looking into, as again, this isn't really something that is so game warping or so different that you could never imagine the Goblomu gear or the Ogre's gear comparing or competing with the or with the rather 88 or 90 sets of gear. Now, moving on from this, we should also talk about the pros and cons specifically of this. But before we get into that, this is the specific Angelica, or the Angelica that you're seeing on screen right now, that I've been using in most cases just to farm out my hunt. And again, if you're curious if this is a team or some sort of content that will clear, or if you're curious as to whether or not a Goblomu piece will affect your clear, the answer is no, because put simply, as I randomly put on any of my hunt characters or hunt activities, and this is probably something that you guys are all doing right now as well because of the new Adventurer's Path, which I'll be making a guide for later. You're probably familiar with the fact at this point you're going to be using characters like this currently in order to clear whatever content. Now, again, just for the sake of this, I'm going to do quick battling just to see how quick or how slow or how fast it would take us to clear this content. Going to claim some energy. And again, because of the way that some of these characters work, having any gear whatsoever will result in a clear, and it's not that big a deal. Case in point, I'm going to have a bunch of these quick battles, and though, of course, some of the 88 gear may prevent you from dying a little bit more, or may be a bit quicker in terms of how you use the Goblomu gear, like you may have faster clears, ultimately, a clear is a clear, a completion is a completion, and this whole myth that you can't, or that you wouldn't get value out of the Goblomu gear or the Ogre's Armory gear, is just false. It is definitely gear that is used as filler. Now, that said, we should actually talk about the pros and cons of this, because there are actually quite a few. Now, first and foremost, we should definitely talk about the fact that now, if you take a look at it currently, it does actually cost roughly, where is it? It does roughly cost 8 energy, or it does actually cost here 8 energy to clear. Now, in terms of this, I would actually consider this a pro, because of course this is a very cheap, inexpensive way to farm a random piece of gear. But in addition to this, as I mentioned earlier, these are all very relevant sets for PvP, for PvE, etc. Now, in addition to this, if you didn't see, there are also reduced costs to upgrade this gear. But there is a bit of an asterisk with this, where, as you can see, this is the last time I made a video about the Goblomu or the Goblin gear. The cost in the past to upgrade a piece was actually much cheaper compared to now. Now, of course, what you're seeing on screen is it only costing 61 in the past to upgrade a piece to plus 15, which was amazing, and it was super, super cheap. However, by contrast, now it costs 282, which is a severe hike of over 4 times the cost. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is also a bit or I should say this is a bit of a concern in terms of planning, but as you're seeing on screen, it did also cost more energy to farm out Goblomu gear in the past, and you do also have, or you did actually have, less value or have less consistent access to the Goblomu gear, so that is something to consider when weighing the pros and cons of this. Now, moving on, it is also worth mentioning that, of course, the main stats of all these pieces are very low, and in general, the rolls that you have access to are extremely low as well. But if we're also just talking about things as a whole and not just comparing the old gear compared to new, Ogre's Armory as a standalone piece, only having 10 pieces a day, is a more neutral or maybe negative leaning consideration, as again, it does feel bad that you can only do this 10 times a day. And the only alternative to this being purchasing it through Skystones is okay, but honestly a bit psychotic, considering that you're paying for or you're using Skystones to maybe get an additional 10 random pieces of gear that have likely 80 or low equipment or 80 or less equipment score. However, none of this is actually nearly as relevant as actually one of the biggest downsides to the Ogre's Armory gear, especially as a new player, which is the new current Orbis guide. Now, this is something that I know a lot of you guys have probably already taken a look at, but if you haven't seen this already, there are actually a lot of new sets of gear that were being given just for completing these activities. Now, if you're looking right now, you can see that there's packs specifically with penetration sets, destruction sets. They've got basically everything that you would need to clear the early content with the characters that they provided. And just for context, if you haven't seen what these pieces look like, they're absolutely incredible. I mean, if you see right now, this is a penetration ring, an attack percent penetration ring that has 97 equipment score, which is ridiculous. I also received a penetration neck that was 98, a second attack percent penetration ring that had 99. And more often than not, I mean, most of the pieces that you're seeing here are either serviceable for new players or actually usable as endgame pieces. I mean, 99 on a piece like this is also incredible, as again, this is a destruction piece and you could definitely use on any bruiser that you choose. Now, for me specifically, I find that to be one of the biggest detractors for why the Goblin's Army gear is maybe less relevant. However, keep in mind, of course, that this is only technically 9 or so sets of gear that you have access to. And if you are someone that isn't able to farm out something like Rift, or if you struggle with the hunts for whatever reason, or don't have access to the hunts for whatever reason early on, this is maybe something that you could consider using, especially if you're trying to just quickly gear something for content like PvP, or rather for Arena or for Guild War. Now, that said, it is also worth mentioning that something that was announced earlier with the epicseven Origin update, something that's mentioned with the Origin update, is that now in World Arena, you will actually have sample gear, or basically I guess like free characters and builds that you can use in World Arena. So even in terms of the value that you'd have from filler gear on characters, the value drops a little bit more, as they're even offering you other shortcuts to kind of be able to access content or play content in the game, regardless of what kind of content or regardless of what kind of gear that you have. Now, ultimately, in terms of whether or not you should farm the Ogre's Armory gear, if you're a new player, you could definitely argue formally that this is gear that you'd want for earlier pieces of content. However, because of the Orbis guide, you could perhaps argue that this is gear that maybe has less value. Now, on that note, you should also note, or you should also be aware that despite me saying that you get additional, sets of gear, the conditions to unlock some of these activities in the hunt are not that simple. For content, or I should say for a piece like Wyvern, maybe this isn't as big a deal, as of course everyone's going to be doing Wyvern, but let's say that you're doing something like Hunt. If that's the case, the amount of gear that you get, or the frequency, or wait, actually I don't think you even get it from Golem, I apologize. Is it from, I thought there was another set that you had access to. Here it is, yes. In case you're doing something like Banshee, this additional set that you have access to is kind of distant, as again, in order to even get to this Banshee 1 content, you would have to do stuff like Awakening Vivian, getting Vivian, and again, while that by itself is not too difficult, that does require you to, again, complete through or go through some of the content. Now, again, this does also, say on screen that you're allowed to save your challenge hunt if I'm not mistaken, want to bounce between and begin some content or go through a bit of content back and forth. But overall, my point is that the rewards, specifically from the Journey of Succession, are nice. However, they're not accessed literally at point 1 or at the very start of your epicseven journey. Now, overall, again, I don't think that this is something that is super insane. If you decide to farm for this and you're a new player, it's fine. It costs very little energy. 80 energy to farm out 10 pieces of gear is kind of a steal, as if you do content like Wyvern, you will sometimes not get any gear at all. However, in terms of whether or not you should probably farm this as a mid to late game player, this is likely not something that I will find too much value in, especially as, again, we're reaching that point where maybe in a future update, or maybe in a more consistent or with more progression towards quality of life, crossed fingers, they'll just add equipment sets or free unequip. Hopefully, right? Right, epicseven. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for today's video, though. Ultimately, again, if you want to farm for Ogre's Armory gear, that's fine. There are very clear pros and cons to it. If you're a new player, it's not even, even if you decide to farm it and everyone tells you that it's wrong, 80 energy a day is not going to grief your account by any means. And if you end up getting a piece that is decent, well, it's decent. Sometimes farming gear in epicseven is a pain, and especially if you aren't someone that's at the point where you can farm Rift and stuff, kind of sucks. In any case, though, that's going to be it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed this format more. I apologize for a bit of the rambling, but I tried to put something together in a bit more PowerPointy and more cohesive manner. So I definitely struggled with it. Anyways, that's going to be it for today's video. I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.